All right, Legends of Runeterra open beta season is upon us. I wanted to make this beginner guide of sorts to kind of go over general concepts, basic overviews, how the game plays out, all the basic things about the game so that you have it, and then we can all go about and conquer the world together. I put timestamps below of all of the topics that I'm going to go over, so if there's something you want to learn about specifically, you can go to those, go to right to it, make it easy because there's a lot that I'm going to cover, and if there's things you don't need to know, you can just go skip those, but otherwise, sit tight and let's talk about Legends of Runeterra. So Legends of Runeterra is a new competitive card game by Riot, and it's set in the League of Legends universe. If you've played games like Magic, Hearthstone, Shadowverse, stuff like those, competitive card games are probably nothing new to you. If you haven't, don't worry, I'm gonna go over basics and how the game works for you as well. In this game, you battle against your opponent with the goal of destroying their Nexus. Each Nexus starts at 20 health, and think of that as like the player themselves that you're trying to defeat. Whoever's Nexus gets to 0 loses, and the other player is the victor. All right, let's talk about deck construction. So building a deck, every deck has to be exactly 40 cards. So in this game, you cannot have less, you cannot have more, you need exactly 40. When you build your deck, each deck can contain no more than 3 copies of any one specific card, and you can have no more than 6 champions in a deck. When building your deck, you choose a faction, and you can have up to 2 factions that kind of control the theme of your deck themselves. Think of factions as, if you've played Magic, for instance, factions are like your color wheel. If you played Hearthstone, they're like your heroes. Otherwise, they're the theme of the cards that you put in your deck. When you build a deck, you can only use cards from the factions that you choose. So, for instance, if you pick Demacia as your only faction, you can only have cards from Demacia. There are 6 factions in this game at launch. There are going to be more in upcoming expansions, but right now there's 6 factions, and let's go over what those are. So if you've played League of Legends, these factions are probably going to sound very familiar to you. If you haven't, here they are anyways. So the factions are Demacia, Freljord, Ionia, Noxus, Piltover Zaun, and the Shadow Isles. Again, when you build your deck, you can only use cards from whatever faction you choose. Each faction has something that makes them unique, a very specific play style that they like to play, and like a general feel to them. But something really cool about this game is every faction has the ability to fit into whatever playstyle you prefer. While you may not be like the best at something, you can still play a playstyle that you like in any of these factions. So each faction has 4 champions from that region that kind of represent them. And I'm going to briefly go over all of them and talk about what each of the factions does. All right, let's talk about Demacia first. So Demacia's champions are Garen, Fiora, Lucian, and Lux. Demacia has really strong defensive tools, a lot of unit buffs, cool combat tricks, and they really like to thrive on putting out a lot of efficiently costed creatures and making them bigger and keeping them around in combat for a while. Demacia generally, at least right now, they see a lot of success with like aggressive, more mid-range decks, but something really cool that Demacia has is the, I'm going to call it an alternate win condition with the champion Fiora. So Fiora, she's really cool, and what she does, if you can kill 4 different units with her and she survives, then you win the game. And that's pretty sweet. All right, Freljord's champions are Anivia, Braum, Ashe, and Tryndamere. Freljord is a faction. They generally have the biggest units, and they're the only faction that has access to mana ramp or mana accelerant as well. They have cards like Weirding Stones and Catalyst of Aeons that give you more mana gems than your opponent, that let you play those bigger, expensive units ahead of them. You'll generally see Freljord decks being a little more control-y or mid-rangey, since they are a little slower to develop, but in the end game, they've got big, powerful stuff. You can also see them be more aggressive or mid-rangey and make use of the champion Braum. He likes to be able to stall the game until he levels up and then kind of take over the game and become undefeated if left answered. Ionia's champions are Karma, Shin, Yasuo, and Zed. Ionia is all about evasive threats, being elusive, and avoiding incoming damage. They're also the only faction that has access to counter magic in the form of Deny. Ionia has a lot of really strong combo potential. They've got cards like Dawn and Dusk and Karma. And they can also be very efficient at aggro decks because they have very evasive threats that they can keep around and chip apart their opponents slowly, and be very annoying to kill. Champions like Zed as well that they have access to are insanely aggressive, and they can really close out games faster than you would expect. So the Noxus champions are Darius, Draven, Katarina, and Vladimir, and Noxus is definitely known for their very strong early aggression. They have some of the most aggressively statted minions like the Legion Rearguard and the Reckless Trifarian. They definitely like to close the game out as early as they can, and what they lack for in the late game power, they make up for in early aggression. Noxus is a perfect faction for you if you want to beat up your opponent and smack them in the face very fast. So for Piltover and Zaun, we have Ezreal, Jinx, Heimerdinger, and Teemo. I'm going to refer to them as P and Z because Piltover and Zaun is too long to say. They're very unique in that they're a pretty balanced faction. They don't have a huge emphasis on offensive versus defensive, but what makes them unique is a lot of their spells, which they're really spell-heavy faction. A lot of their spells can be used offensively or defensively. So a lot of their cards, such as Mystic Shot, you can use it to either kill minions or also shoot the enemy Nexus, which is pretty unique in this game. They also have access to the unique mechanic of Puff Caps, where they essentially put poison mushrooms embedded into your opponent's cards, and when they draw those cards, they take damage equal to the amount of Puff Caps that are on the cards. It's a pretty cool mechanic where you can slowly chip away at your opponent's life total or fill their deck with a ton of them at once and kill them in a combo finish. All right, last we have the Shadow Isles, and they have Hecarim, Elise, Kalista, and Thresh. Shadow Isles is all about balancing life and death. They're the only faction that has access to life gain, and they have a lot of mechanics that rely on either sacrificing your own creatures or effects that happen after your own creatures die. They get a lot of really powerful sacrifice mechanics, such as Glimpse Beyond, that lets you draw extra cards. Shadow Isles also has access to very powerful aggressive tools that utilize the ephemeral mechanic. Shark Chariot, for instance, is a card that anytime you play an ephemeral creature, it comes back from the dead and goes attacking the opponent. They can be very aggressive, and Shadow Isles is kind of right now being touted as a faction that's really good as a secondary faction that fits pretty much any role. All right, so now that we've gone over all the factions, let's talk about the card types in this game. So there are 3 types of cards that you can build your deck with in Legends of Runeterra. So you have followers, champions, and you have spells. All right, so let's talk about followers first. So your followers are like your units, your creatures, your dudes, whatever you want to call them. Each follower card has an attack value and a defensive value that shows how much damage they'll do in combat and how much damage that they can take. Their attack value is the number that's on the left side of the card, and their defense value is the number that's on the right side of the card. Also, if you're looking at the card, you can see on the very bottom, there's going to be a little colored gem that shows you the rarity of the card. And if it belongs to a subclass like Spider, for instance, that's going to be in the top middle of the card. So other than just your basic stats of attack and defense, there are a lot of keywords that can be on a card as well. Keywords are like special abilities and extra text on the card that do things. These keywords can either be completely spelled out in the middle of the card, or they can have little symbols to denote what they are. There are a lot of keywords, and rather than going over every single one individually, I've made a little cheat sheet or a little guide for you that's in the description down below that you can kind of utilize, download, save, whatever you want to go through all of those, because there are a lot, and I chose not to go through every single one of them because that would have taken a whole nother video on its own. All right. Let's talk about champions. So champions are very powerful and a very important part of Legends of Runeterra. So they're essentially super powered followers, and that's why a lot of your decks are going to be built around the champions themselves. So what makes champions unique is that every single champion has the ability to level up. When a champion's level up condition is met, that champion will turn into its leveled up version of itself. For instance, Jinx condition to level up is your hand must be empty, but once this happens, she turns into the upgraded version of yourself. Champions will get a boost of stats, and they'll also contain some new powerful abilities and keywords as well. Also, when a champion levels up, all other copies of that champion will be leveled up as well, which is pretty awesome. So once you've leveled up your Jinx, for instance, every time you have a Jinx and play her, she'll be leveled up as well. All right, so something to pay attention to when you're looking at a champion's level up requirements is if they're speaking about the card themselves saying I've, or if they're talking about you as the player saying you've. So for instance, if the card like Fiora says I've done something where it says I've killed 2 enemies, that specific card has to be the one to kill those 2 enemies. So if for somehow you have 2 Fioras and one kills a unit, the other one doesn't get counted as killing that unit as well. But if it says you've done something, that means that it's something that you as the player has done. So for instance, Ezreal says, you've targeted 8 minions with spells. And what's cool about that is those cards, if they talk about you as the player, don't actually need to be in play for those to happen. They're called global effects. So for instance, talking about Ezreal, where he says, you've targeted 8 minions with spells. So even if you don't have an Ezreal in your hand, if it's still in your deck, if you as the player has through the course of the game targeted 8 minions with different spells, once you've drawn that Ezreal, he'll level up when you play him, which is really awesome to know. Also, the last thing to know about champions is if a copy of that champion is in play and you draw another copy of that champion, they'll turn into their signature spell. So if you were to draw a Jinx while you have a Jinx in play, the Jinx you draw will turn into her signature spell of Jinx's Get Excited. And then if that champion is removed from the game, that signature spell reverts back into the champion itself. All right, so lastly, we're gonna talk about the third type of card, and that's spells. So spells are very powerful effects. They're broken up into 3 different categories, and you can utilize the very unique mana system that Legends of Runeterra has, and that they use spell mana as well as regular mana. So let's talk about the 3 different types of spells, because this is something that's very confusing, especially if you are newer to card games themselves and learning how the spells work. The spells themselves are broken up into 3 categories, and that determines when you can play the spell. So there's slow spells, fast spells, and burst spells. So slow spells can only be played before or after combat, but you cannot play them during combat. And whenever you play a slow spell, your opponent has the ability to react to the thing you did. Some of the most powerful spells in the game are slow spells, such as the Ruination, but they need to be strategized when to properly play them, because your opponent does have the ability to react to it once you play the card. All right, so next we have fast spells. So fast spells can be played before and after, but they can also be played during combat. Your opponent can respond to fast spells, but you can queue up multiple fast spells at a time before your opponent gets the chance to respond to them. A lot of the removal in the game and combat tricks are example of things that are fast spells. Last, we have burst spells, and these ones are unique in that they can be played before, during, and after combat, but when you play it, your turn doesn't end, so your opponent doesn't have the option to respond to them. So burst spells are super powerful since you can play them at any time and your opponent can't really respond to what you do. So cards like Take Heart can really blow out your opponent in combat and turn the tide of battle. All right, so let's talk about the mana system in Legends of Runeterra. So the mana system in this game is different than any other game that I've ever played on the market. So mana is the currency that you use to play your cards. The amount of mana that you need to play a card is in the top left of the card. You start the game with 1 mana gem unlocked, and at the start of each new round, your mana gems will refill that you have, and you'll unlock an additional mana gem. You can always see how much mana you have by looking at the middle right of the screen, and then your opponent's mana will be right above that, so you can see how much mana they have as well. Additionally, underneath your main mana gems are your spell mana, where you can see how much spell mana you have. Now, a really cool thing about the mana system in Legends of Runeterra is that if you have unused mana at the end of your turn, you can save up to 3 mana of that as spell mana. So your spell mana is the 3 little dots that you see underneath your main mana, and you can use these specifically to cast spells. Another cool thing about that is this mana does not ever drain. So once you have some mana saved up, you can keep that in your spell mana pool. All right, so now that we've built our deck, we know the type of cards, we're ready to do some battle. So let's talk about how the actual game plays out. So each round, the players alternate from being the attacker and the defender. But every time there's an action taken, the opposing player has a chance to respond to it. Okay, so at the start of a round, both players draw a card, and then the person who's the attacker is denoted with a sword on the battlefield, and the person who's the defender has a shield on theirs. So the attacker gets first priority in the round, choosing if they want to attack with their units or if they want to play cards first. Once they play a card, though, the defender gets to play a card as well, except for the case of burst spells, of course. Then once the defender plays a card or passes, the priority shifts back to the attacker, and he can decide what they want to do. Once both players pass their turn, that round is over and the next one starts. And during the next round, the defender and the attacker swap, and then this continues on the cycle until one player is defeated. So during combat, the attacker chooses which units they want to attack with first, and then the defender chooses if they want to defend with any of their units. When 2 units battle, so if someone attacks with a unit, the defender chooses to block that unit. Both of those units deal their damage equal to each other, equal to their attack. If a unit's defense is reduced to 0, that unit dies. Any units that are not blocked deal that much of their attack damage to the opponent's Nexus. Then after the battle happens, both players can continue to play cards alternating between each other until they both pass the turn and the round is over. So some notes about combat. If the attacking player decides to attack with their units before playing any cards, the defending player cannot play any slow spells or units before the combat happens. They can only respond with burst spells, fast spells, and their units in order to block. So sometimes it makes more sense to attack first before you play anything so that you can get in some guaranteed damage, whereas other times you'll want to play things before you attack. That's a lot of the strategy in the game, as well as kind of deciding when you need to attack first or when you need to play other things. Another thing is that units that are doing battle can both attack and also defend. So if you're coming from games like Magic, where if you attack with a creature, that creature cannot also block, it's not the case in this game. So units that you play can both attack and then on the defending turn also defend as well. Another thing to note is that units do not heal any damage that they've accumulated unless they have the regeneration keyword. So any damage that happens during combat or from spells, they're going to keep those wounds until you either heal them with a spell, they heal them with a special ability, or they die. So this is the basic gameplay that happens until one player's Nexus is reduced to 0, where that player loses, and hopefully you are the victor. So there you have it. That's the basics of Legends of Runeterra. Let me know if you want me to make any other guides going more into depth on anything specific. I just wanted this to be a kind of overview, general, how the game works, how the cards work, factions, etc. Let me know in the comments down below if there's something specific that you want, something I missed, and we'll keep this discussion going. 72 puff caps. We only need them to draw 4. Now there's 75. All right. This is the moment of truth. Just draw 4 puff caps. 1, 2, 3. No! What? Seriously? This game sucks. Come on. Oh, I'm so mad right now. Oh, man. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you like what you saw, it would mean a ton if you would hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell notification to be notified when I post some videos, share this with your friends, all that kind of stuff. You're amazing. I love you. And until next time, you stay saucy.